everyone, welcome to Handing the Shame Back, a show dedicated to the adult male and female survivors of child sexual abuse globally. We know the numbers are huge, we know they're underreported, but potentially there's up to 1 in 3 men and women walking around who have experienced some form of child sexual abuse. This show does have trigger warnings, and the reason for that is because survivors talk about their experiences not for any other reason than that something they may say may help you, beautiful audience. You may hear one thing our next guest says and feel, gosh, I can relate to that, or oh, him too. So I've given it away. It's a guy and he's great. So the trigger warning is there. If for any reason you do feel triggered, please go to the show notes below and you'll be directed to some resource and help. In the meantime, have I got a guest for you? So I'd like to introduce you to Craig Heiting. He is a husband, he's a father of 4 children, and he's a survivor of sexual abuse. So welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As with all our wonderful survivors, I like to start by, asking you a little bit about yourself, what led to you being on this show, and what you're up to in this space. So again, Craig, one thing you may say may just spark something in someone else out there who is looking for a way through. So,
Well, good. So just start. I'm a
yes.
father of 4. Been married 35 years. I thought it was 36, but my wife corrected me today. That is 36 this year. And I just broke my silence about 5 years ago, where I accepted, and I knew that I had been abused, but I buried it so much and didn't want anyone to ever find out my secret. So that only came about 5 years ago, when I told my wife, I told my kids, and lots of loved ones at that point, and started my healing journey, which hadn't happened until that point. And we can talk about that more. But the today, so like so many survivors, you often want, once you're through the healing process, not through because we're never done, but once you're into the healing process enough, you want to help others get there. And one of my biggest things has been, it was tough to find the resources that I needed to find where I could begin that healing journey or go through the healing journey. So I was on a ravishing hunt to find resources and to find ways to get information of any kind, and it wasn't easy to find. I had to dig. I had to do research and really find those resources and other people who were survivors. Because I didn't even know there were any other survivors at the time when I broke my silence. I thought that I was the only one. And that's, again, a lot of survivors feel that way. So when I did that, a lot of survivors do this where they're into their healing journey and they decide that they want to help other people. And so I've been really dedicating time to, as a speaker for RAIN and co-chair for Men at Voices Beyond Assault, to try to help other men break their silence and not wait as long as I did, because it was, now that I know all of the things I put my family through, put my wife through, and put myself through, it was a darn shame to wait as long as I did, to decide to begin that healing journey, or to not always decide. Sometimes it's decided for you, as was in my case. Uh,
Yes.
but
So
you can't wait
one
any
thing
longer.
so one thing I would say though, but please cut yourself a bit of slack. When it's for you, it will find you. When it's time for it to merge, it will. You can't force it. You can't make it happen if it's not right. So just, I always think, trust the process. But Craig, I do want to know, not in a voyeuristic sense, but details like, how old were you when the abuse began? Who was the perpetrator? Are you able to give us a little bit of context around that? How long it went on for?
Yeah, my abuse. So we had moved to a new home, and my brother was much older than me, so we had a completely different set of friends, and I didn't know anybody, and we had some neighbors that were older, and one of those older kids was became my abuser, and it was about 8 years old when it began. Lasted until 14, just before I was entering high school, and they were trusted friends. I mean, my parents used to hang out with his parents, and he had brothers as well. My brother hung out with his older brother, and they had access to our home and access to us, and my parents weren't around very much because they both had to work, and my father also had an alcohol problem where he wasn't home as much, and so he had access. They had keys to our home, and um, my abuse was quite. Um, it was quite violent. So it started with being strangled until I passed out, and and then I would come to, and pants would be down, and I didn't know really what had happened at that point. But then I started to fake being passed out because I didn't like that. The idea of being choked until you think you're going to die when it happens. And so I became really adept at acting. I actually should have gone into acting because I was so good at it. And I would just pretend to be passed out until he was done and he would leave. And that happened for many years, and it became where, like, I would be walking home from school, he would jump out behind the bushes and drag me behind the bushes. One time I was when I was young, I was selling Christmas trees, and he attacked me there. Or I was at I'd come home into my house, be the only one there, and he'd jump out of a closet. He'd been waiting there for hours, things like that. It was quite quite horrific, and so I just when I finally put an end to it, and I put an end to it because I got taller and bigger. Uh, I'm 6'4" now, but I wasn't then. But I was certainly you know bigger, as big as him by the time that I put an end to it, and it was just something I never wanted to think about. And I tried to tell my parents when I was 12. One of the altar boys that I served with, he was found with a priest, and so I thought this was a great opportunity because I knew that it was something, to do with his privates and everything. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to tell my parents. And I was walking down the hallway, and I heard them talking and saying he must have done something to make father do that to him. And I was like, okay, so this is all my fault. I can't ever tell them. And that's how I believed for a long, long time. And that same year, I tried to commit suicide, and
As a
and
12-year-old? As a
yeah,
12, yeah.
as a 12-year-old,
Yeah.
and good thing 12-year-olds don't know how to do it
No.
very well.
Mm.
So I wasn't successful, thank God. But the that was it though. When I and it still took me a couple of years to figure out how to end it. But when it failed, I tried hanging myself, and the rope broke, and it was a rope made of clothes. It was really dumb. But when I fell down to the ground after I was dangling for a little bit, um, I remember deciding that I was going to take my life back, and he was not going to win, and that I was going to figure out a way to stop it.
So just I need to stop you there because wow, this is really, really powerful. There's so many things about this, Craig. I think for the audience watching, these trigger warnings are in place because of things like suicide attempts. And as survivors, it's not uncommon to us. The great news is, did you hear what Craig said? He said he decided then to take his life back. So I don't know if you realise the power of those words, Craig, but that's really encouraging for our beautiful survivors watching. You hit the ground and then decided to take your life back. Well done. The other thing
Yeah.
too, of course, is that you couldn't tell your parents because as children, our rationale or logic is not as formed as theirs, and so in your childlike mind, how could you, if you'd heard that they didn't really would believe it, which was not true, was it? But the point is, what about your older brother? Were you ever able to talk to him eventually?
No, I wasn't. We became he moved out. Actually, part of the reason that I was able to probably end it was because he moved out and got married. As a lot of Wisconsin people do, they get married very young, and he was quite young, um, and so we became estranged, and I don't know why. I never knew why he passed away a couple of years ago prematurely, and I never really got to talk to him because. Because partially I couldn't see him because his spouse didn't like me for some reason, and any time I would go home to visit my mom, he would have to sneak out to see me, and then it wasn't ever. By the time that I broke my silence, COVID started to happen, and I just never went back, and I never saw him, and then he passed away before I could talk to him, or my mother, for that matter. So, um, really, the only people that know are my cousins, some of my cousins and things that are of family.
Was that partly you trying to protect your parents, do you think? Or was it,
Not telling them, or
yeah,
well, they
as
were gone by the time that I broke my
oh,
silence. By the time that I came to terms, and that again, is sad because I mean, I don't know that I would have wanted. My dad died very when I was very young, but I don't know that I how my mom would have reacted. I think she would have just felt very, very badly because she didn't notice the signs. I used to, and I talk to parents about this all the time. I was alone. I would go down to our rec room and just sit in the rocker and just rock for hours, and just be alone. And I think she was concerned a little bit, but she didn't ever ask me what was up. If she would have, if she said, "What's wrong? There's something wrong. I know it." I probably would have told her, but it never occurred to her because she had so much to deal with my father, and getting him out of bars all the time, and having to worry if he was going to come home that night, or be in an accident, and there was so much going on there for her, and her family had some issues too that I just didn't. I think she just didn't. I was safe, right? She thought I was safe since I was in the house, and was probably the least safe place that I was ever. And she kept the house almost until she passed, and it was very difficult going back and visiting, and I would try to just block that out of my mind and
Yeah.
not remember anything.
Yeah. Do you, looking back, um, I guess, Craig, do you think that there were other victims of this older neighbour?
I believe that there probably was. I don't know. He had a little brother, and I wonder about that.
Yeah.
And uh, he had another brother that I wondered if anything had happened. And his father was very abusive also. And I don't know if there was sexual abuse, but his father was very much, he feared his father quite a bit. And so I don't know, but I just remember, like, my mom was worried that I didn't have friends, and she would make me go with this family to their hunting, and 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 I just knew that it was going to be a whole weekend of constant abuse wherever I went, if ever I was alone, or ever that he could find a way to get me alone, and it would just be a weekend of torment. And I begged my mother not to make me go, and she was like, "You need to go. You need to do this. You need friends." and
Yeah.
and I couldn't just say, "Yeah, this is not where you want me to go." Um, but it was interesting, the the dynamic in my family, because my brother and I were too far apart to be close, and so I was really pretty much an only child, and I was home alone a lot, and that's what I find that permeates through the men that have been abused, is that they're alone a lot. They're easier to prey upon because they get targeted because they don't have that family support system close by.
You mean as children when they were
Yeah,
being abused? Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, and these predators know what they're doing equally. Um,
Well, and I thought he was my friend. He was like paying attention to me and taking me to places and playing sports with me, and you know but then it became very much like, you are my friend and nobody else's friend. You don't hang around with anyone else. Just tried to dictate what classes I was taking. He was older, so he wanted to tell me which classes I was allowed to take at school, and it became very controlling. Yet we never talked about the abuse until I met him with a very large knife and said, "It's either you or me or both of us, but you're not going to get out of this without being hurt." And that was the first time I acknowledged to him that, yeah, that I knew what he was doing.
and was that when you were 14?
Yeah,
And what happened, Craig? What happened when?
he turned around and ran, and never saw him. A few years later, my wife and we had two kids at the time. We're visiting my mom, and we're in a grocery store. And my wife's so much more assertive than I am, and thank God. And I saw him in a grocery store, and I just froze. And my wife immediately knew something was wrong, and she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "That guy over there was mean to me when I was a kid." That's all I could say, right? And she's like, "I'm going over there right now." I was like, "Oh, please don't stop. Just don't go over there. Don't make a scene. It's okay. Let's just leave." And yeah, that was the only time I'd seen him afterwards.
How old did you feel at that time?
I, you're right. That's a good question. I felt like I was back
Yeah.
being 9 years old. Yeah.
And there's a reason for that, Craig, because for our beautiful survivors watching, people don't always understand that the trauma continues and that it doesn't matter how old or how young we might be, when we see that person again, we are not the age we are. We immediately transport straight back to the first or one of the first times the abuse occurred. It's quite powerful.
You know, it happens even later with other people too, because when I was about 33, I was at a company event, and this very high up person in the company started buying me drinks and getting me drunk. And then he said he would take me home, and he molested me. And I just, you think, well, how could a 33-year-old, how could you let that happen? But I went back to being a 9-year-old.
You and I.
I went back to being a victim.
Yep.
And that's a lot of people don't realize that until you acknowledge and begin and go through your healing journey, you really could be a target again, because you will be susceptible to further abuse. And I just never thought it would happen again. And that up until that time, I thought I was doing very well. I was a great husband in every way, and everything. And at that point, um, as my wife will say, our marriage became vastly different. I thought I cheated on her, so I went internal into myself and went into depression bouts, and pulled away from her emotionally and physically. And it was a long time before, and she thought it was her fault, right? She thought I wasn't attracted to her anymore, and she realized I was just completely in disarray. I thought, how could this happen to me again?
Mm. And look, thank you so much for sharing that, because that's something that people struggle with. And of course, you and I would understand that it's shame that keeps people from being able to express that. I've had a few survivors on the show, a few females who have said, and then at 22 it happened again. And of course, the audience watching might think, well, hang on, you were an adult then. You'd moved out of home, the abuse was 6 years earlier. Why would you let that happen? And that's what you're trying to say today, I think, because you're not the adult in that moment. You're immediately transported back. We call it dissociative amnesia, yeah? So there's a part of our brain that is immediately triggered and transported back to the child. But, so
And I often wondered if that happened today, and we have all of the talk and the resources and the awareness. I think I would have. I hope I would have, but I think I might have had a much better chance of reporting that, and then getting the help I needed at that age, rather than waiting another, 15 years after that.
so let me ask you this then, because it's really really wonderful that you're telling us all of this. You made a point earlier that had you done the healing or broken your silence, that would in all likelihood not have happened. Can you tell us a little more about that link, please, Craig? Because I think it might help our beautiful survivors watching.
Yeah, I really firmly believe, because I feel like this will never happen to me again, because um, I now know the signs. I know a lot about what predators are looking for and what they do, and how they repair their victims. I know the signs that something is could happen. I know that. I think, but I think it's more than that. I think it's innately when you're on the healing journey and you've come to terms with what's happened to you and you're working through it. I think innately you no longer show that you're a victim. You no longer exude that being a victim to potential predators. And I don't know how to quite put my finger on it, but I think that um, I don't feel like a victim anymore. I feel like I never will be a victim anymore. And I can't say that before 5 years ago that I think I still was a victim and I could have been a victim again, and I was a victim again. And I was a victim all the time in many ways that the abuse was affecting me, from running from jobs and moving my family because it got a little uncomfortable where I was, and not being able to confront uh, things, right? Confront people and confront things. I just ran away from any conflict, and my career could have been better. My family certainly could have been better. My marriage certainly been better, and I could have been a lot better. I would have been able to, you know, cope with things that were going on and know why they were going on. I didn't have any idea why I needed to leave. I just knew I needed to leave. I just knew that this was an uncomfortable situation, so we needed to move. And I would move us like 1,000 miles away just to get as far away as possible. And my wife was so good about it. She was like, "If you need to do this, we'll do this." And she didn't know why. She just thought because I needed to do it, I thought it was the best thing for my career. But that's not what it was about. It was about me leaving.
You were
But
running,
I
running.
didn't even realize that until I finally stopped running.
Well, it's interesting though, because, Craig, you had 6 years of this. And the reality is, as a child moving into that adolescent phase, um, it's the power wasn't with you and the power wasn't on your side. So even though at the final point you were able to stand up with a knife and protect, the reality was you'd had 6 prior years of horrendous abuse. This wasn't a person who was sexually abusing you. He was terrorizing you, if you don't mind me saying. He took delight in you being shocked, hurt, manipulated, and exploited. He enjoyed all of that. But the way this permeates into our lives is what I think wider society doesn't understand. You look at how you had to move. You look at how you couldn't face into things in terms of perhaps conflictual situations, or stand up for yourself, or you didn't understand why. This has very long tentacles, and I often struggle with society wanting to block us all the time from ever really dealing with this. I call it the silent endemic because no one really wants to know. And so what happens is we've got people like you and I walking around. Many of us are still in the shadows and kept in the dark because it's scary.
Yeah.
One thing I would like to ask you is, did you, in later, since you broke your silence 5 years ago, did you ever consider approaching the abuser or the police or anything like that? Anything like that happened for you?
He's not alive anymore, so I did try to find him, and he had committed suicide.
Did he? Okay.
And so, um, I didn't think there would be any point in finding his brothers or anything like that, because I didn't know what that would serve. Um, So there wasn't any point in it. Instead, I, worked on telling my story, hosting other survivors on a monthly program too, in hopes that they wouldn't wait so long. I mean, in therapy, I did write him a very long note, and I think we do that often. And I wrote my mother, I wrote my brother, wrote my father, and that was very helpful early on in my healing process. Was just to confront them on paper,
Yeah.
and I felt like I had a lot of peace from just doing that, especially with him. Um, that gave me a lot of. I felt like he heard it and he knew it.
And I like that because I was going to ask you about closure. Although you said there wouldn't have been a lot of point in approaching his family, I thought, oh, what about closure? But you've just covered that off for me. So, for survivors watching, it doesn't much matter how you deal with this. There are many ways of doing it. And, I think what Craig's talking about is a really powerful one. And it can be a way of releasing what you've held on to. And you may be surprised at the words that emerged. Were you surprised at what came out, Craig?
Yeah, it really was, and
Yeah,
it was just flowed out so well. And then my therapist had me read it to him, and I just, you know,
yeah.
I felt so powerful. I took the power back by telling him what he did to me and how, it was wrong and that I knew it was wrong and how it affected me. And, um, you know, I took power back. He didn't have the power anymore.
And you handed the shame back.
And I handed the shame back.
Never belonged to you. Never belonged to you. You know, I'm
That was the biggest thing, was guilt and shame
yeah,
and all this. I think I had told you earlier about my college friend who came to me and told me he was raped by his mentor, and I just, because I was burying what had happened to me, I couldn't help him, and he ended up not surviving. And I felt so guilty about that for so many years, and it's hard. You still feel it a little bit, you can't help but go back there all the time to that night and think, just wish that I knew what I know now, and I could have, helped him.
do you know, Craig, if the situation were reversed, would you want him to feel guilty?
No, absolutely.
There you go then. Look, the
Yeah.
reality is it became what it became. And had you been or able to have dealt with what you had experienced, it may have been different, but you would never judge him were the roles reversed. So try to be kind to you. There's only two people that need to hold the shame and the guilt, and those are the abusers and the predators involved. Can we now hear, nice little segue, thank you. Doing great, by the way. Into VBA, tell us what that is, please, what you're involved in, how it got set up.
So I first joined the RAINN Speakers Bureau, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network in the U.S. And they were one of the resources I went to immediately. They have a 24-hour hotline. It was amazing, and I utilized their services. And then as I moved through my own therapy, I thought I was ready to tell my story, and I joined the Speakers Bureau. And they had some training, and you get trained, and you to tell your story. And um, one of the panels I was on, and I was always the only man on the panel. It was always a little bit of a joke, but I mean, not a joke that it was
No.
the panels weren't. It was just it was I was always the token male, right? And but it was nice that they always were reaching out, and wanting to get at least one male on the panel. It's like not that easy to find males that participate. So on one of the panels was a woman, and she was we were talking about how do you relieve stress, and we were talking about different things that we did, and she said, I just put a pole in my bedroom and I do pole dancing. I just started laughing so hard, because I just hadn't thought of that as like something that people would do, but she was so fun about it, and I was like, I have to get to know her a little bit. So she had reached out, and we talked, and she started this organization called Voices Beyond Assault, and she said, I'm having this Saturday, I'm having a retreat for survivors, and I didn't even really know the term survivor yet. And I went to it, and there were probably like 5 or 6 men, and it was the first time I'd ever met another male survivor. It was amazing. And so one of the people I met was a younger guy, and so he was in his 20s, and he was like, Brianna, she came to us and she said, would you guys like to start the men of VBA, and do some programs, and just whatever you guys would like to do to get awareness built around men. And we said yes. And I thought it was a great idea, because it's nice to have a younger generation and an older generation. You don't want to just have me up there, right? You want to have like everybody represented. So Lauren and I do a program once a month where we interview sometimes survivors, sometimes doctors. It's predominantly geared toward the male abuse perspective, but interestingly enough, it's about 60 to 70% of the attendees, because it's live, are women. So it's really neat. I love that, because I think because I talk to some of them, and they say, well, we want to hear about how it is for men too, because we want to understand every aspect of survivors. And I just think that's so incredible. Women are just at first, I mean, when I went to look for a therapist, I was like, yeah, I can't talk to a woman about this. and I didn't end up getting a female therapist, but I mean, I could now. But the I have the same therapist I've had for all these years, and but it's women are very emotionally present, and men aren't always emotionally present. I find that survivor males are more emotionally present than non-survivor males, but it's still hard for us. It's hard. It's harder for us to come and let our emotions out, and things like that. I remember the first time I cried in my therapist's office. I was like, I'm not supposed to cry. Sorry, I don't know why I'm doing this. And he's like, are you kidding? It's okay. Let it out. And I'm like, we are told not to cry. We are told not to. We are told not to be victims. We are told to fight every step of the way, and never allow ourselves to be put in a position of victimization, and that's why we remain silent so much more, I think. And so we don't really know how many men are victims of childhood sexual abuse. In the US, we talk about 1 in 6. There's a organization called 1in6.org. They think it's more too. And I think it's more. Certainly it's just terrible that both male and females are abused Um, but I think both our numbers are higher. When I talk to people, it's like, one of the things that was so amazing when I first started becoming healing, you want to tell your story to everybody. And I travel a lot for business, and I would be in a bar and just having a little food or something, and the person next to me would be talking, and then all of a sudden I'd find out that she or he were victims of child sexual abuse. And then and it just, like, all of a sudden, like, all these people were coming forward in my lives, or I'll talk to somebody and she'll say my brother was abused, or oh my gosh, it's like so prevalent, and you're like, oh, this is not a small problem, this is a huge, huge, huge problem. And the more we talk about it and get it out there, and don't become shamed of talking about it, and the more, that's how we're going to prevent it. That's how we're going to curtail it, and it cannot be accepted. It cannot be buried anymore, because the more, if we bury it, then the predators win. And that's why I speak. And a lot of people say, "Wow, you're," because I'm still very much involved in business and things like that. People say you're so brave. I don't feel brave. I feel like I have a duty to do this, because this is the only way we're going to stop it.
Yeah, and look, I agree with you. It's the silence around this is deafening, yeah? Why this is not on every billboard in every country in the world with massive campaigns, only you and I would know the answer to that in terms of our survivor family, because the narrative doesn't suit. But what we're seeing is the cost, Craig. And as you're talking, it's making me realise in Australia, over 65% of prison inmates, male and female, have been sexually abused. Over 85% of addictions can have their core with this childhood trauma. Yeah? Over 70% of PTSD sufferers are not Vietnam vets, who, by the way, were trained for combat, got awarded medals, got lifelong benefits, and were put on platforms and honoured. PTSD, they don't have the biggest group. It's people like you and I.
Yeah, my daughter is a therapist at a
Yeah.
alcohol or drug and
Yeah.
alcohol rehabilitation, and she handles kids that are teenagers.
Yeah.
And she tells me that 90% of them have been either physically or
Yeah.
sexually abused.
And this is it. So my thing to you is, where's the noise? And it's people like you and I and our beautiful survivors watching that are prepared to, let's normalize these conversations, because shame can't exist where there's compassion, empathy, and light. Can it? But
No,
shame will exist in secrecy and silence. And the winners, as you just said, are the perpetrators. So, the world needs to wake up, I think, because this is not going away. This is actually getting bigger, not smaller. And we have a lot of our, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of our men are not given permission to speak, because they have to be brave, they have to be courageous, they have to be the protectors. They're not allowed to cry. Thank you, Craig. Thank you for crying. And they're not allowed to show vulnerability. Well, let me show you a photo of a 6-year-old boy with front teeth missing. That's a child trapped inside that male body. They can't speak.
no, and if we want it to go away, then the predators win. Because if we try to bury it and we try to pretend it's not around, they win. And these are our children we're
Yes.
talking about. These are the future of our world.
Yeah.
And, I think we owe it to all children to protect them, and to find a way. I mean, I speak a lot to parents, And I say, you have to have the conversation with your kids. You have to teach them what is inappropriate. If they feel uncomfortable to tell you, you have to be open to them talking to you. And you just have to ask them all the time if they're okay.
Yeah.
And that's as important as anything else, is just talking to our kids. And, but that only goes so far because then you have the children who don't have parents around. And who's going to protect them? And it's got to be everybody's job. It can't just be the parents. It's got to be the teachers. It's got to be the principals, the therapists, the people that are, if you observe a child who's all alone, or you need to talk to them and find out what's going on, because that's not normal. It's not. And what I was doing was, as a kid, was not normal.
No. There's other behaviors as well, and I just want to give you one little thing that I use that I find really powerful, and then we'll move on to tips you might give our survivors who maybe are struggling to find their voices. So just before that, I'm a little bit loath to ask. I'm happy to ask children or teenagers if they're okay or what's going on, but what I equally do is hand over paper and pen, because they've usually been threatened into silence. They can't speak because if they do, someone's going to be hurt or someone's going to be next or whatever the predator has used. But no one said that they couldn't write something down. They're just not allowed to speak of it. So maybe keep that in the
That's
back of
good.
your mind. Use that as a
Yeah,
tip.
definitely.
All right. So, Craig, as we're moving into close, what tips would you offer to male and female survivors who perhaps haven't quite reached the point of breaking silence? What tips might you give them to help them?
Well, I mean, the most important thing was finding a therapist, but not everybody has the resources to be able to do that, and I understand it. And
Yeah.
I mean, so I spent equal amount of time reading, and I found books, and I found books from all areas of abuse, and talking about, the effects of it and how to start the healing journey, and to recognize what's going on. And there's a lot of wonderful books out there. There's a lot of research. You just got to find them. And it's nice now that you have the internet. That we have the internet, and you can do a search on these things. But that's not necessarily the best way. So how I found my first book, I watched Leaving Neverland, and it was very early in my process. I mean, it was very early. I just broke my silence, and it was so difficult to watch it. And but I knew immediately they were telling the truth, and
Yes.
I knew immediately that what they were saying was the truth, because you couldn't say things like that. You couldn't know things like that unless you were a survivor. And Wade Robson, one of the young men, is coming on my program on April. Um, but the afterwards, Oprah Winfrey did a special where she did a talk show with Wade Robson and James Safechuck, and she had this person stand up who had written a book called Joining Forces, and Dr. Friedkin. And I wrote it down, and I ordered the book immediately. God, that was so amazing, because it was all these stories about men who had gone through abuse. And it didn't matter if the beginning of the story was different, because the middle and the ending was always the
Always the
same.
same.
And I find that with men and women, by the way. It's like it doesn't, so that's why I don't really focus on the abuse itself. I focus on the healing, and how to make sure you start that healing journey, because we all go through the same things, and finding books that, first of all, show you you're not alone and show you that's the first step, right? Is the first step was finding out that I wasn't the only one. I felt that I was the only one that this had happened to, and I've once that opened up, and Oprah had that audience of like all these men, they held up their pictures of when they were accused. I was like, oh my God, I'm not alone. And I just started crying immediately because it was such an amazing feeling to know that you're not alone. And that's the first step.
Yeah, 100%, because that's, as you said earlier, I'll remind you, you said that actually when you broke your silence, you realized for the first time you weren't alone. That,
Right.
yeah. So I think it's really powerful. Um, Craig, any last thoughts from you just before we do finish? Anything else you'd like to say to our audience watching today?
Well, I mean, I just am so thankful for you and for other survivors that are out there spreading the word and helping people with resources. And I would just say to everybody that, you're not alone. If you are being abused, you can stop it, and there's people that will help you stop it. And if you are living with that shame and guilt, there are there are resources that will show you that shame and guilt are not yours, and that you can heal and you can have a fulfilling life still. And that's probably the biggest message. And don't wait too long to start that healing journey so that the rest of your life is ahead of you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Craig. Stay right there.
Thank you.
I'll just close out. So, audience, really, really powerful and grateful to Craig today for all his wisdom and sharing his story with us. The thing that still sticks in my mind is him talking about the suicide attempt at 12 and hitting the ground and then deciding to take his life back. And that is what it can be for all of us. We can decide to do that. So, as always, I see you, I stand beside you, and I believe you. Please do like, subscribe, and share this video.